1913 AD. The cruise liner Orpheus suddenly disappears, leaving its rumored 26 or more passengers to an unknown fate. 1899 AD. Henry Osmond confronts a sinister old man on a train holding his own granddaughter hostage. Agents of fate of a red stone versus blue, relentlessly hunting each other throughout generations. Corruption triumphs over justice, as the red stone has for centuries, but hope persists. Before escaping, Henry bestows the blue stone onto a little girl, Crea Rockwell. 1937 AD. A young man receives a parcel with a small key and a phone call. His father's house burned down at the same time. Upon investigating, he discovers a peculiar passage containing a book recounting his father's encounters with the red stone. Beyond that, a shimmering painting of an old ship lost in the ocean. Thus begins the chapter of Richard Osmond aboard the orphaned Orpheus, as crashing waves echo through the night. Echo Knight is Fromsoftware's 7th game on the PlayStation 1, released shortly after Shadow Tower in 1998, where Shadow Tower took Kingsfield into a mechanically harsher direction and diverted away from storytelling a bit. Echo Knight takes the complete opposite approach, focusing almost entirely on exploration, narrative, and puzzle solving, with no actual combat mechanics while still maintaining the tried and true Kingsfield control scheme. Key differences being the added ability to crouch, giving more depth to the environment, with the opportunity to hide secrets in narrower corners. Second being the ability for the player to change their movement and turning speed. Since combat is no longer a concern, the increased speed doesn't make the player wildly overpowered, and thus the player can actually turn at a normal speed in one of these games. Lovely. Although the faster movement does take away a bit of the tension from the few hostile ghosts Richard encounters throughout the ship, allowing the player to easily outmaneuver them or quickly rotate to a light switch, which expels the ghost from the room. This is not a huge detractor from Echo Knight's sense of horror though, because the game evokes that feeling through its atmosphere and surprise when a ghost actually does show up. Echo Knight is a very atmospheric game with little background music but plenty of ambient sounds to properly immerse the player. Pair that with the infrequent hostile ghost encounters punctuated by eerie music, and each appearance is able to elicit fear relatively easily. Despite this, I would still not fully classify Echo Knight as a horror game. It's still largely focused on exploration, and the sparseness of these encounters lead the game to feel more like a classic adventure game that keeps the player on their toes. The main goal for Richard is to help all of these souls pass on by jumping into the past to help resolve their final regrets before boarding the Orpheus, such as a man who never got to say goodbye to his wife, whom Richard gives her engagement ring to. This includes the vengeful spirits that have largely forgotten who they were or why they still lingered, leaving them to not be a persistent threat across the whole game, rather functioning as a progression block or similar to a puzzle in themselves. Since the player has no combat options, their only means of defense is avoidance whenever these ghosts show up. They can only be properly confronted when all prerequisites have been met. This is what further adds tension to whenever hostile ghosts spawn in a room. While the player has light switches, there is no way to get rid of them until their past is resolved. Sometimes lights don't work either, leaving the player helpless beyond escaping. Presumably, facilitating these souls passing on will help Richard get to the bottom of his father's disappearance, but he also met a mysterious stranger, something of a sorcerer, residing with an observatory through an astral book that bestows upon him a fragment of the blue stone his father once owned. It seems that it's been broken through the years, and is now fated to be in Richard's hands. The man also requests the remnants left behind by spirits for something special. He sounds a bit ominous, but granted the good faith gesture of the blue stone, Richard has an inclination to at least humor this request. The blue stone is what's supposed to allow Richard to dwell into past memories and pull objects from them to resolve guilt. But Richard has already been able to do this through the train book at the beginning of the game, being pulled into the Orpheus itself, and the Sailor's engagement ring. Perhaps this is a latent power bestowed upon the Osmond bloodline given his father's fate with the stone, and acquiring the complete version would just grant him its full power. Whatever the case, it seems this was destined to happen. Richard is the only one who can unravel his father's mystery and possibly put an end to the Red Stone and untold horrors committed by its wielder. Within the first hour of Echo Knight, there has already been a much more concentrated effort at storytelling compared to former Fromsoftware titles. Ironically, Echo Knight spends the least amount of time in an intro prologue, with only a few lines about the Orpheus disappearing before immediately jumping the player into the role of Richard Osmond. The rest of the setup is experienced by the player themselves rather than being a long cinematic intro like in Kingsfield 3. While I love the story of the Kingsfield games, they are rather front-loaded with information before the player has any bearings in the world, whereas Echo Knight stretches its exposition out while simultaneously teaching the game mechanics, letting it steadily seep into the player's mind, made more impactful by experiencing the events firsthand, like in the train scenario. Echo Knight's immersion aids its storytelling greatly as well, allowing the player to set themselves in place of Richard. This is not just drawn from the game's soundscape. The layout and design of the Orpheus itself is very coherent and realistic as well. Despite its many blocked pathways and progression barriers, it feels natural to progress through. Exploration is rewarding by granting the players shortcuts throughout the ship. Backtracking is rarely necessary to begin with, as each segment of the Orpheus is self-contained and regards to its puzzles. Still, shortcuts ease navigation, allowing the player to gauge where they are and create a sense of scale or layout for the ship. The Orpheus doesn't feel like a loose connection of hallways and rooms. The attention to detail was there to create a real, functional place. Take for instance the fact that every residential suite has adjoining bathrooms that serve no purpose mechanically. There are several different bathrooms with their own unique assets, movable toilet seats, custom bathtubs, light fixtures, and this is just the space with no relevance to the main game. The bathrooms are indicative of how much care and attention to detail was poured into crafting Echo Knight, which is further seen throughout the entire Orpheus with countless unique wall textures, furniture, dozens of themed rooms with wacky or bizarre aesthetics, even a fluid day-night cycle to add more depth to exterior ship cells, and the already beautiful interior lighting system. The weather changes in multiple flashbacks, but this isn't just a scripted scenario. This can also occur on the docks of the ship with rain, snow, or fog that greatly contribute to the illusion of time passing. No two places in this game feel the same. Even each one-off past recollection has completely original textures, models, and overarching aesthetic. Quite impressive given Kingsfield's tendency for identical corridors in each area. But I suppose the large asset pool of Echo Knight can be achieved in a title with very little character or enemy models at all. Echo Knight is a lonely game. The absence of people is integral to its ghost ship premise, and the ghosts themselves are only transparent figures, leaving just the hostile spirits with a fully textured appearance. This makes wandering through the Orpheus all the more lonely. It's easy to soak in all of the atmosphere when it's just Richard and rushing waves. Thus, the absence of many modeled NPCs is not a downside. The few characters that are textured are fairly detailed, for better and worse. Henry Osmond looks pretty normal, whereas the old man looks quite creepy in his excessively detailed face, likely on purpose to make the player uneasy from just looking at him. All of this added effort into visual design helps stand Echo Knight out as one of Fromsoftware's most beautiful PS1 titles, and ties in well with its exploration, as not only is scanning every corner of the Orpheus worthwhile for puzzles, it's kept visually interesting with the diverse look of each room. Puzzle solving is the player's means of progression, as each minor story plays into the main vengeful ghost of each area, meaning there are usually multiple separate branches that can all be solved non-linearly until linking linking together at the end of their dedicated area. The beginning arc is a great primer for this, as Richard is bound within floor 1 of the ship, blocked on one end by a spirit pushing him back, another by a ghost steward still trying to fulfill his job, and thus not allowing Richard to pass into a party without formal attire, and lastly, the same girl that tossed Richard around upon entering the Orpheus. The way to get around all of this is by taking care of the girl, which unlocks a dress suit and transports the player behind the other spirit, where she can then be taken care of by a light switch. In order to save the little girl's soul, however, Richard needs to gather medallions from the other guests throughout the hallway, resolving their own minor stories. Beginning with Richard recreating a man named Ed's signature drink by looking at paintings. Whoa! I genuinely need to censor this one. And correlating the objects within said paintings to the amount of drinks mixed together. Although the E painting gives a bit of misdirection given there are technically 3 snakes in the picture. Another medallion is accessed by moving a stool to reach a vent, a completely new mechanic from any previous Fromsoft game that is also used in the final puzzle in this stretch, taking place in mirrored rooms, where the ghost lady from before prevents the player from reaching one of 2 sisters. The game telegraphs the rooms being mirrored via an out-of-place double door noise, and the opposite door also closing in front of the player while exiting one of the rooms. It's something stand out enough for an attentive player to notice, but doesn't give the solution straight away until entering both rooms. The funniest part of this puzzle is that the player needs to shove a heavy radiator in front of the bathroom door so that the ghost can't open it. Finally, the player has to examine all of the medallions in the menu to figure out where to place them. All of these puzzles are unique from each other, which remains consistent throughout Echo Knight. Despite involving new mechanics such as crouching or moving objects, they are relatively intuitive to figure out and do a good job at seamlessly teaching the player all their options moving forward. All these puzzles really require is that the player pay attention and fully examine their environment. If the player couldn't figure out which drink referred to Ed's, they could search a side room for an additional hint, signaling to the player that everything they need to progress is accessible close by. Echo Knight is a bit of a step up from Kingsfield puzzle design, which was typically using the right key on the right object, sometimes in lengthy quest chains. That was suitable for Kingsfield as a large dungeon crawler where exploration was rewarded with key items to obtain better equipment or open up more pathways. Echo Knight can go beyond that with logic puzzles more dependent on the player thinking deeply due to them not being constantly hounded by skeletons. When Echo Knight does engage with a classic circle peg and square hole scenario, it typically adds more layers of complexity. Take for instance Richard's first moment on the Orpheus, where he only has rubber gloves, a door handle, and needs to activate a fuse box in order to proceed. Well, if for whatever reason you think the door handle is enough to complete the circuit for the fuse box, you can go right ahead and... But clearly there's more needed to progress. Finding wire cutters to open up a dresser not only grants Richard a new special item, but also allows him to grab the cut wire back off the ground. Then the solution is clear, however you still need to equip the gloves unless... Throughout Echo Knight, the player will have several random objects with inconspicuous use case, or former key items that remain in their inventory without much of a clear purpose. To its credit, Kingsfield did have this type of object obfuscation that somewhat distracts a player from an otherwise clear solution, but it stands out much more in Echo Knight when nearly everything picked up has a purpose, whereas Kingsfield clearly differentiated its unique items. In Echo Knight, the player might not know if their current inventory is required for the immediate roadblock. Instead, a lot of puzzles run concurrently, and the added abstraction of figuring out what proper key to use makes these rather simpler puzzles far more interesting. At the end of the hallway, Richard confronts the ghost girl who throws furniture around and bars the player from advancing. Only upon leaving after every other spirit has moved on is Richard met with a mysterious ghost boy who transports him to the abandoned Rockwell family mines, where the girl's father is desperately searching for his daughter. The mines were supposedly closed down due to all the gold being excavated, but over time, more people around the area went missing, and authorities just correlated that to cave-ins. A dubious claim given how well maintained it looks, and why would children go around playing in mines anyway? Her doll is there, and Richard brings it back after her father finally uncovers her body under rubble. The doll helps the girl, Claudia, remember who she is, and that she doesn't belong trapped on this ship. This is where Richard finds the dress suit before getting struck on the head by a strange one-armed figure. By now it's been established that these spirits either can't hold objects or only attack Richard through secondary means such as spectral projectiles or Claudia hurling chairs or lifting Richard up and tossing him. Perhaps there is another human aboard this ship who expected us to be here. Richard wakes up in an infirmary with the spirit of a doctor, who blames himself for the death of an Arthur Rockwell. The player needs to wait for him to leave his room on the Orpheus in order for his past version to leave his lab in turn, allowing the player to scavenge a prescription paper and confront him with his guilt. He doesn't disappear, however, as we've merely made the problem worse, but this opens up the second segment of the ship behind the woman that was pushing us away before, who can be dispelled by a light switch well hidden amongst engraved constellations on the hallway, leaving behind a fetid pool of poison blocking our escape. The puzzles within this stretch are nothing unique and more so a long chain of key items leading to an antidote to clear the way, a result of this area being very small, only containing 4 rooms. The sequence culminates into a scene showing the Doctor a film of Arthur Rockwell being stabbed by the same old man as on the train holding the red stone, the woman he was with meeting the same demise. This frees the Doctor of his guilt. It seems that he was put up to poisoning Arthur by a certain Sir William, and perhaps the stress is what killed him in the end. This all takes place in 3 out of 4 rooms down here. The real star of this area is the casino, baby! Let's go gambling. Put it all on 17. Damn. Well, that's alright. The floor manager is such a nice guy. He'll give you 5 more chips. Alright, I'm feeling 17's gonna hit this time.
Well then, here are 5 more chips.
The casino is an incredibly fun and out-of-place diversion for such a dreary game up until this point, with a fully fleshed out roulette table, slot machine, and blackjack game mode that makes me wish Fromsoft made a PS1 casino title. There's even an event where the manager will kick you out past closing time, the true gambler's experience, which I only know about because I spent multiple full in-game days trying to hit the jackpot on 17 until it paid out. There have also been casino vouchers well hidden throughout the Orpheus that grant 20 tickets when cashing them in, but who needs that when the manager is just such a nice guy?
Seems like you have a lot of luck. That over there is a slot machine, which is right over there. The object is to guess the number you think the ball will land on. If you guess wrong, then you lose your chips. Please, come again. What do we have here? Where do you think you're going?
After winning it big, the player is able to challenge the blackjack table where they have to double their 100 chips while constantly being berated by the dealer. Is it my turn now? Yes, I literally only hit 1 time. That's your 5th consecutive loss. All of this serves an actual purpose. These are still lost souls aboard the Orpheus that Richard needs to free with the power of gambling. And once winning at blackjack, they all depart, thus ending the best casino Fromsoftware have ever made. Taken too soon from this world, the ominous sorcerer has tasked Richard with gathering all of the astral pieces left behind by the ghosts, so there is at least something to be gained by completing this side diversion. This casino houses the few completely non-story related spirits. All of the pieces could technically be missable if the player never picks them up, but they are guided through all of the pieces except for the casino staff throughout a normal playthrough. The jukebox also dies down once the ghosts pass on, and with it fades away the funkiest and most light-hearted track within Echo Knight. As stated before, the game's audio design is largely comprised of sound effects and ambience, so it's a bit unusual to have background music outside of ghost chases and cutscenes. Its inclusion does feel natural for a recreation area and ends up building more immersion of the space once it goes away. You might think discussing realism on a ghost ship where the protagonist is constantly being sent to the past sounds silly, but a lot of Echo Knight's design is trying to create believability in the space, whether the player consciously recognizes this or not. Think back to the bathrooms occupying each residential room that serve no purpose, yet the player can interact with the toilet seat or even flush it. They can also move plenty of small to medium-sized furniture in any room however they please. The environment is not not static nor shallow, creating an echo of a real space the player can interact with and change. In contrast, the past recollections are almost entirely unable to be influenced by these same mechanics beyond the player solving one scripted goal within them. There are no objects to move, environments are very small to prevent wandering, and NPCs will stop Richard from messing with things. This creates a framing where the player has much more agency within the Orpheus than in any of these flashbacks, leading them to believe they have no influence over them at all, using mechanical limitations to convey to the player what they, and as a result Richard, can or can't do. Keep this in mind for later. Not only will this be on the test, but this plays a key part in the story as we progress. Richard now passes the drip check and meets with the victims from the film, Arthur Rockwell and his sister Hilda. They had organized this family cruise in order to lure their father, William, onto the ship, where they had planned to kill him over fear of the red stone possessing him. Of course, bringing the rest of the family aboard was necessary to avoid suspicion, but William had already planned to do the very same, getting the upper hand on the siblings and dooming the rest of the passengers' souls adrift the endless ocean. It's not clear what William was planning to do after the rest of his bloodline ended. Perhaps he thought the red stone would allow him to live forever. It very well might, given how old he already was nearly 40 years ago on that train. It appears at this point that nearly everyone aboard the Orpheus died as a result of William's actions in one way or another, be it the little girl within the Rockwell mines, those who were coerced into killing for William and being unable to live with themselves, or the ones directly killed by the red stone like Arthur and Hilda. The Rockwell family are simultaneously the greatest benefactors of the red stone, as in only one generation William brought the family name into immense power and wealth, but also the biggest victims of its consequences. Even someone as innocent as Kreia was dragged into this mess before she even knew what was going on. The identity of William Rockwell in this moment isn't meant to be a big reveal. It's information I've intentionally obfuscated up until this point, but the extent of his crimes and how deep they cut, even into his own family, is a pretty big revelation that's quite understated. Richard gets taken into a very cool castle flashback to discover how the red stone got into the family, with the mercenary Alan Rockwell brutally slaying a king to steal the stone for himself. This reminiscence doesn't make a whole lot of sense when taking into consideration the one generation line Arthur states about his father bringing the family into prosperity. The murder of the king takes place in 1469, several centuries removed from the present and William's time. Maybe the stone had been in the Rockwell family ever since then, but over time knowledge of its power faded away, or was intentionally sealed for generations in fear until William claimed it once again in desperation. Regardless, Arthur then urges Richard to take down his father while bestowing a stone plate upon him, which combined with 3 others spread throughout the Orpheus will open up the family hall where William presumably sits. A clear goal and progression line finally established to the player besides the general saving ghost souls objective. This brings Richard to the front of the ship and back into conflict with the ghost woman. This second hostile phantom already differs greatly from the little girl, as the only means of circumventing her were running, while this one actively pushes Richard away, remaining anchored in the same place, unable to be circumvented by constantly leaving and re-entering the room. Richard has to actually distract this ghost in order to get behind and toggle the light switch. Distraction is more of a scripted gimmick rather than a new mechanic, and inserting a small gear into the crow nearby is clearly telegraphed. The real puzzle lies in the player having to take out the gear and use it in a completely different part of the ship. Not a revolutionary mechanic, as even Kingsfield 2 did this with its rhombus keys. However, this is yet another subtle teaching of Echo Knight to prepare the player for the very next area, using the gear on a clockwork parrot that a ghost servant is fervently stressing out about. Saying Sir William will kill her over it merely being broken seems like an over-exaggeration until it opens up a compartment containing the second stone plate. Shattered. This transports Richard back into a winter cemetery, where if he's unable to break through a trapdoor into a tomb, the creepy, slow-walking gravekeeper will snatch him and pull the player out of the past. The crypt itself is very strange, a sprawling, damp labyrinth with blood oozing from the walls. Then, The old William Rockwell shows up, beckoning Richard to leave the tomb, only to trap him into a corner with a dead woman resembling the same spirit blocking our paths. He pulls out the red stone. The purpose of this crypt is to lure people as sacrifices. Then begins the first chase in Echo Night. This is one of the most tense moments of the game, even with it being undercut by William walking incredibly slowly. This is the first time the player is threatened by a real human who can't simply be dispelled or ran away from. Well, I mean, you can. Richard has to grab the fish plate William placed and use it multiple times throughout the crypt in order to open gates, meaning if they forgot to pick it up at any point, they have to run back, likely passing William, requiring the player to juke the old man at least a few times throughout the chase. This is a surprisingly effective scene at eliciting fear. The margin for error is pretty generous, but the stiffness of Kingsfield controls allows this moment to still challenge the player. Simply by upgrading to a human enemy, the game throws off all of the player's expectations from a threat. Not only will they be stabbed for real instead of tossed around by a ghost, William is a persistent chaser beyond loading zones, being far more terrifying than a spirit bound by one room. This is compounded by all of the buildup for William being a cold-blooded monster. The first time we're confronted directly against him is beneath the frigid, dark earth, with no chance of help. It only lasts a short moment, however. Richard escapes with the fish plate and a pendant from the murdered woman that can now be used to save her soul. Back on the Orpheus rests the pool area, which fully showcases the mind-boggling potential of the PS1, making good use of interior lighting, the dynamic skybox that can be seen through the glass roof that even turns into a blood moon after draining the pool, and the intricate detail engraved into the outer rim of said pool with its fossilized theme. This is one of the most beautiful rooms in Echo Night, showing the abundance of visual detail in every corner of the ship. The same boy that helped Richard from earlier grants him a fish's eye to place at the bottom of the pool, and brings him into a library to decipher the legend of the two stones. Richard walks into— oh, library's closed. Dang. Well, social barriers have never stopped him before. Continuing the tradition of silly solutions, all Richard has to do is crouch under the reception desk and problem solved. He then continues to be an incessant nuisance to public workers in order to pull one away far enough to steal a book. What a great guy. The book recounts an ambiguous legend of the two stones, describing the red one as having the power to change destiny, allowing the holder to mold their own fate by sacrificing the lives of people, but only mentions the blue stone as being the opposite of the red stone, and never to combine them or suffer an unknown fate. It's not clear if the blue stone being the opposite of the red stone means that the bearer cannot change their destiny, or possibly that they can change fate by saving people's lives. I think this book is intentionally vague and slightly misleading because it's only a legend of humans trying to understand the supernatural without any first-hand evidence. What this book really serves is to confirm the idea that the red stone derives its power from sacrifice. That's why William has murdered so many people with it by luring them into tombs and abandoned mines. It also introduces an idea that the blue stone might have some power of its own, and possibly a way to remove the evil influence of the red stone from the world by combining them. It's not a lot to go off of for now. Richard still doesn't even have the full blue stone to follow through with the idea. The hunt for the remaining two stone tablets brings Richard down to the crew quarters of the Orpheus, who then gets jumped by the old king, pulling him in and preventing him from switching any lights. This might be it. Nothing down here still works, as to be expected from a rusting ghost ship. Father? I guess with his house burning down, he had to disappear somewhere, especially after leaving that mysterious note. He had to expect Richard to find this place. Henry doesn't seem too keen on catching up with his son, however, still captivated by his hunt for the red stone that eclipses everything else in his life. At the beginning of the game, Richard said he never heard from his father since he left home. Richard is only 25, and implies that it's been a long time since he moved away. Judging by that and this current interaction between the two on the Orpheus, they likely didn't have a good relationship. Richard's father was hunting for the red stone before he was even born. Henry has hasn't given up the search all this time, and it's likely driven him into a delusional state. Perhaps Richard was just a means of continuing his legacy in the hunt for the Red Stone, or another card for him to play against William. Notice how Henry is now missing an arm. His figure matches exactly to that of the shadow that struck Richard from behind with a bat. It's possible Henry planned for his son to go looking for him on the Orpheus after he went missing, instead of sending the key as a last-ditch effort. He is fine after all. He's made it deep into this ship with only one arm, no less. Maybe Henry needed us here to finally get the upper hand against William, his own element of surprise and unconscious helper, as Richard has been clearing the way to William all this time without any direction from his father. Even if he is family, it feels wrong that we've been taken advantage of like this, and it's a detail that flew right over my head without noticing the missing arm shadow on a first playthrough. Richard might not even know either, but has no choice other than continue playing his father's game. Henry leaves quickly to avoid his son from asking any questions. The underboat section is similar to the first area we talked about in the way of a bunch of small puzzles loosely connecting to allow progression. This time, however, I don't feel they're very necessary for discussion, nor do I want to spoil every puzzle in Echo Knight, so we're moving on to the story-related one where the player has to spell out Kriya in Morse code, while on the right radio channel derived from a previous room. The ghost boy that's been helping Richard throughout the ship appears once again, finally revealing himself to be Kriya's brother, giving Richard his music box, taking us to a city 20 years in the past. Within this beautiful chapel lies a dark secret. Not even a holy place is beyond the corruption of the Red Stone. Upon playing Kriya's music box tone on an organ, the altar reveals a deep, spiraling staircase, showcasing that fall damage does indeed exist in Echo Knight if you wiggle yourself into the right position to obliterate Richard's legs. This seems to be the only instance in the game where you can actually die from fall damage, as there aren't any other sheer drops within the Orpheus, and this likely wasn't even intended to be a mechanic, instead a remnant of the Kingsfield engine. At the bottom sits a blonde girl in a regal green dress, who thinks we're here to kill her on her grandfather's orders, but upon playing the music box and revealing the blue stone, she finally recognizes Richard as the other man she saw on the train all those years ago. Kriya lost her half of the stone, however, then promises to get it back before ushering Richard away. This scene confirms some interesting implications that Echo Knight has been hinting at throughout all of these past recollections. Richard is not just a spectral observer of these events, rather he is himself sent back into the past, in his current state from aboard the Orpheus. That may sound a little confusing, but the point is he's not just been a passive observer to these moments, rather an active participant all along and had no idea, nor embodying somebody else from that time. This is how Richard is able to bring back all of the objects he picks up throughout the past. Also explains how the mercenary from the king's murder notices Richard. This makes it all the more terrifying, contextualizing Richard being hunted in the Rockwell tomb by William, although the stone seems to pull him out whenever he gets into trouble. This may also seem like a very obvious point to some, but it hasn't always been clear if Richard exploring the past was more than a storytelling medium for the player to experience these events firsthand and make them more powerful than a cutscene. This is the first confirmation that Richard himself has been traveling to the past and not living through the eyes of somebody else, and a subtle implication that Richard has had agency within these moments the whole time, but didn't realize it. Upon exiting, the brother says destiny has changed its course, before finally disappearing for good. All he wanted to do was help Kriya. His soul can now rest in peace. The other half of this underboat section has Richard wandering through countless dark metal corridors in an effort to turn on the generators. Despite the complete lack of lights in this segment, the king only shows up within 2 bathrooms. This creates an initial bit of tension as some of these halls feel too safe, as if the king could show up at any moment, but never does. This section does a good job at letting the game speak for itself. It doesn't want to annoy the player with constant spirit encounters that'll drag out the puzzles and become more of a nuisance. This leads to the player soaking in all of the atmosphere, submerged below the ocean on an abandoned ship. hearing only the rushing water above, seeing nothing beyond the deep blue and schools of fish shooting by. Eventually, they get used to the darkness and feel a semblance of safety. The king hasn't invaded any of these halls, so when the generator finally turns on, flipping the lights becomes the next natural progression. Then, Echo Knight finally pays off the lingering tension of where the king went, striking the player the one moment they thought they were completely safe. This is mostly a gotcha moment more than anything. The king is barely threatening, still doesn't leave this hallway, and can't actually break the lights anywhere else on the ship. He just wants you to know he's that powerful to terrify you. I bring this up because it's a pretty good example of Echo Knight having the capabilities of being a horror game, but intentionally not committing to it in service of being a better adventure game. In this middle section of Echo Knight, we've seen multiple instances of effectively eliciting fear through being chased in the Rockwell tomb, spirits suddenly appearing on the outskirts of the Orpheus at night, and now the king jump-scaring the player shattering lights. Part of the reason these moments are so effective is because they aren't frequent. They show the potential Echo Knight would have as a horror game. It would still be a strong title if it leaned harder on scaring the player. However, there was a lot of restraint in only placing these encounters in the most appropriate places. This creates a good balance between mystery and horror, where the player is not constantly berated by hostile ghosts and is able to explore in peace while maintaining just enough tense moments to keep the player on edge. After returning to floor 1 through a convenient shortcut linking to the rest of the Orpheus, Richard brings the 4 stone plates together, granting Arthur and Hilda peace and death. Inside the family hall are 4 themed rooms, all with unique beds, bathrooms, family paintings, light fixtures, and ugly wallpaper. Who would want to stay in a room designed off of a burning building? Seriously. Within resides the last few Rockwell family members, including Jack. He's the only person on this ship claiming to have helped William directly, and somewhat justifying his father's actions. Unsettling implications given William locked up Kreia and would go as far to murder members of his own family, but I think even Jack didn't understand the full scope of William's crimes. Clearly he feels some form of guilt given his soul is still stuck on the ship. Only upon handing him an old photo of him and his sister does he remember. This isn't the life he wanted or asked for. Perhaps Jack felt he needed to protect the rest of his siblings by being the one to do William's dirty work. What else could one really do against a supernatural evil? Jack says he doesn't even remember when or how he helped his father. He might not have even been doing so intentionally, or was being influenced by the Red Stone itself. This makes Jack just as much of a victim as the rest of the Rockwell family. Despite any misdeeds, he still suffered under William's evil. I bring all of this up not only to demonstrate the extent of harm the Red Stone has brought even William's own family, but also to showcase how Echo Knight subtly builds that narrative over time. For Jack and nearly every other character synopsis or theory crafting I've done has been based off of very little dialogue. Jack only has 5 lines, which is about the average for everyone else in the game, if not less. Despite that, I'm still able to infer a lot of information from dialogue given their implications, steadily connecting the dots across a playthrough to piece together all of the minor subtext strewn about the game. Echo Knight doesn't directly tell the player much about anything, but throws in just enough small details and parallel points to allow them to piece together an underlying narrative of Rockwell family trauma and unresolved guilt from many of its members. It's subtle enough that most of these details passed over my head on the first playthrough. The red-blue stone plotline takes center stage, and Kreia's abuse is what the player mainly sees, but it goes far deeper than that. Sometimes it seems like William is a positive asset to the family, as he brought them into great wealth and power as Jack tries to justify. However, this is far outweighed by the atrocities he commits, and up until the midway point of Echo Knight does it become clear that blood is not a barrier to William. He will do anything to achieve his goals. His status and wealth have only become a burden to the family, as now they owe everything to him. They can never go beyond his reach given his immense wealth and connections. They are doomed to be a bystander or even benefactor to his evil. In the end, Kreia was the only one to break that cycle. It's at this point that Richard acquires a cameo from the dead king through a different painting. Ultimately, this is the least relevant ghost that Richard helps, but is still a victim of the Red Stone regardless, just not William specifically, which makes him a weird inclusion on the Orpheus of all places. It could be the stone actually traps the souls of victims sacrificed to it, and that's what grants it power, or those killed by it are anchored until being set free by the power of the blue stone. Finally, Richard confronts the man who shot his father, cursed his family, and ruined the lives of many others, though all William does is sit there, peacefully, without any sort of resistance. He acknowledges the countless people he's murdered, with almost a hint of remorse in his tone. William is at the end of his life, and doesn't even remember what it is he sacrificed everything for. The lives of innocents, his family, even Kriya. All the destruction caused to no grand conclusion. Kriya was fighting her own battle to help Richard and his father put an end to the stone, only ending up getting her shot in the back, unable to fulfill her promise. William, in his lust for power, only lost everything in the end, even the red stone itself. That makes sense of why he appears stained with blood and on the verge of death. Richard's father finally got his hands on the red stone, but without the blue one to counteract it, only ended up becoming just as corrupted as William. We need the other half. Without it, there's no hope to put an end to things. We need Kriya. And with his dying breath, William's soul is able to send us back to that pivotal moment. Every single time, Richard has merely been an observer to the tragedy the Red Stone caused, unable to even attempt to change things without being pulled back out. The game itself has framed Richard as unable to impact the past, as the player couldn't interact with these fragments of time in any meaningful way. This is not merely a design decision, as this represents Richard's own idea that he has no power to change fate. Only upon meeting Kriya again in the basement does he, and the player, begin to realize their agency within these flashbacks. Richard has been capable of changing the course of history from the very beginning. He just didn't realize it until the most important moment of both his and the Rockwell family's destiny. If the red stone allows the bearer to change their fates by sacrificing others, then the blue stone allows the wielder to change the fate of others by sacrificing oneself. This is what Richard has been doing on the Orpheus this whole time without realizing it. He's been putting his life on the line, being hunted by spirits and chased by William himself, all to rescue the souls captive aboard the ship that were likely resigned to stay there for all eternity. Perhaps that is what the legend meant. With this knowledge, Richard is able to save Kriya's initial demise by picking up the bullet himself, preventing her from being shot. Unfortunately, the hunter was not alone, and Kriya is still held hostage. However, Kriya is also a wielder of the blue stone. Richard is not the one changing Kriya's fate. Kriya is the one saving his. She bravely stands in front of him, tanking a dozen bullets before pushing the assailant off into a ravine with her own body, dropping the other half of the blue stone in the process. With it fully assembled, the course of the future is corrected. An end can finally be put to this generational madness. All thanks to Kriya. Back in the present, William sits dead in his chair, and Richard picks up the engine room key to the final unexplored part of the Orpheus. This is cue for the player to turn in all of their remaining soul fragments, as this does have a significant bearing on the ending. We'll lead with Richard collecting all of the astral pieces, as this seems to be the canonical ending for Echo Knight. Upon bringing all of them to the sorcerer, he reveals the true purpose behind gathering all of this power, fusing them together to create a new red stone. He then claims it belongs to Richard, as his gathering of all these souls was a direct cause of this new powerful relic coming into existence.
We shall meet again when your fate with the other red stone comes to an end. When that time comes, we shall meet again.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I don't think I follow.
When that time comes, Richard, I've come.
Classic age tech. At the start of the engine room is a poster showing the layout of the chambers and an ominous warning to keep the pistons working while the fuel line is running. While this is not an incredibly subtle hint for what the player needs to do in this area, it might not become fully apparent until later. It does stand out as Echo Knight doesn't have any posters with legible text besides this one, but I think it's justified for the encounter ahead, and it stands out just enough to stick in the player's minds. They'll need to think quickly on their toes for this segment. The reunion with Henry is short-lived, him being utterly possessed by the Red Stone, drowning the area in darkness, making it unable for Richard to use the Blue Stone's power. This marks the second full area chase within Echo Knight by the ghost of William that can float through walls and is notably faster than his former human self. William's ability to phase through walls grants him an easy jump on the player within most of these rooms that typically loop around a small space. This segment of the ship is structured in William's favor, and he can end up blocking the path of key items if the player can't kite him properly. I would love to say that this puzzle is the ultimate test of what the player learned throughout Echo Knight, but it doesn't really take much to figure this one out. If anything, it puts those skills under stress of a constant chase, forcing the player to explore quickly and discover the solution under much more pressure than they're used to. Instead of adding any extra noise to the sequence, it's very straightforward with only a valve to activate the fuel and a key to activate the pistons in two separate rooms. I believe this was made so simple to prevent players from being hopelessly stuck for 10 or more minutes, which would not only be annoying for the player, but also heavily diminish the stakes of the scenario by darting around William non-stop. So while it's not a very complicated sequence, I still think there's a lot of thought and intention for how the player will interact with it, much like the rest of Echo Knight. Forcing the pistons to stop expectedly breaks the engine, causing emergency lights to power on and allowing Richard to fuse the red and blue stone together, making both of them disappear from existence. Henry seems to be free from the corruption, but also appears to be disappointed that they were both destroyed. Maybe he did seriously yearn for the power of the Red Stone all these years, hunting it for his own selfish gain rather than any sense of righteousness. This makes it all the more depressing how completely this hunt consumed Henry's life. He has nothing in the end, just like William. In his hunger for power, he pushed away everything, including his own family, without anything to show for it. He even lost Richard, whom despite coming to his father's aid among the Orpheus, Henry doesn't say a single word. Not of thanks, not an I'm sorry, just pure silence. All he urges is for Richard to escape while the Orpheus is blowing up, either not caring for his own safety or feeling so much remorse that he cannot continue living. Decades risking his life for the Red Stone, estranging his family, losing an arm, even luring his son onto the ship in a final desperate play, only for it all to be worthless. Maybe Henry realizes in this moment his folly, and if he had set for the Red Stone out of justice for its victims, his story would have been different. Maybe in this moment, he cannot bring himself to say it, that Richard is a good son, more than he deserves. Richard has 99 seconds to escape the ship before going down with it. His father only tells him to escape to the front of the Orpheus, leaving too much unsaid. As Richard makes his way through the same engine bay up to the storage room, the mysterious man makes his last appearance, ushering Richard through a marked fake wall. With the sacrifice of the Blue Stone, Richard no longer has the power to shape destiny or travel to the past. This is the opportune moment to be tempted with a stronger power, that of Richard's own Red Stone.
Hello, I've come. I told you that I would come, didn't I, Richard? Oh, I almost forgot. Here, take it with you.
Choosing whether or not to take the knife leads to drastically different outcomes, and the Richard who selflessly aided all of these hopeless spirits to get to this point isn't the one who would easily falter under the pretense of power.
You don't need this? Strange. You are indeed a strange man.
Richard meets Kreia for the last time in the present, the only ghost aboard the Orpheus left with her soul intact. She teleports Richard out, saving him one last time before the ship erupts into a golden light. Back inside his home, Richard still has Kreia's music box as a reminder of her and all the people he's saved. The power to change fate may be gone from this world, but Richard doesn't need any help in shaping his own future. Thank you, Kreia. Farewell. That was obviously the best possible ending for all characters involved, but what would happen if Richard didn't gather all the souls to begin with? He wakes up back in his father's house, staring at the clock as if it were all a dream. The policeman from the beginning drags Richard out to leave, however the car won't start. Instead of a toolkit, all that lies within its trunk is the red stone, William's knife. The implication being that the cycle continues again with a new family. Either Richard forgot everything aboard the Orpheus, or doesn't learn enough from all the spirits he saved about the evils of the stone, using it, presumably, to murder the police officer if he succumbs to its allure. If Richard accepts the new knife made specifically for him, the outcome is much darker, as while the same scenario occurs with the policeman, Richard straight up murders him with the new knife, foregoing the ambiguous ending and guaranteeing the cycle continues. What if Richard doesn't make it out of the Orpheus in time? I'm sure you can guess what happens then. Echo Knight is not the first Fromsoftware game to have multiple endings, but I think there's a lot more depth to these scenes than the Kingsfield 3 bad end. The player can recontextualize Richard's actions as a means to power or a selfless endeavor. Kingsfield 3's bad end is a result from the player not finding enough secrets, while Echo Knights are a direct result of player choice. The narrative was already very well done, with many subtle underlying threads that all tie together into the central red-blue stone conflict. These endings weave them together in a satisfying way that makes the player's extra invested time in these side stories or examining the subtext feel worthwhile. Echo Knight consistently builds its story throughout the game, with most minor ghost NPCs still contributing to the overarching plot, sometimes with their own sub-story that enriches the world. These details can be easy to miss on a first playthrough, but make the game even more intriguing during a replay. Throughout this video, there was a lot of speculation in trying to decipher the subtext. I tried to root them all in reasonable assumptions derived from the English localization. The translation is surprisingly good for this title and effective at delivering enough context through just a few sentences at a time. I'm sure there are some details lost in translation, but overall this is one of the few times during this Fromsoftware history series so far that I've felt the age tech localization has actually been good, or at least reliable enough to tell the game's full story. Kingsfield 2 was rewritten as a standalone story since the first game never released outside of Japan. Shadow Tower supposedly had a lot of details and world building shaved off to where that game barely feels like it has a story at all. And while Armored Core is a decent outlier in all of this, Echo Knight is the first Fromsoftware story I've been able to dive into and extract all of this wonderful extra sub-narrative without having to rely on any external manuals, guides, or secondary interpretations. As a result, I could be wrong about plenty of the theories, but I'm simply relying on everything that Echo Knight tells me. I also had a lot of fun doing so, much like with Armored Core. I lack much of a proper conclusion for this piece because most of my key thoughts have been explained enough throughout the video. Echo Knight is a very compelling story and puzzle entry by Fromsoftware. It stands out both in form and fundamental design, sharing the frame of Kingsfield while taking a wildly different approach to the player experience. It has a well thought out narrative that still incorporates typical FromSoft elements of ambiguous storytelling paired with an easier to understand central plot plot that tie together into a satisfying conclusion, further showcasing that the vagueness of certain other games is not a crutch used to compensate a lack of writer's skill. Rather, it's Fromsoftware's definitive style that creates the intrigue in many of their games. Echo Knight is also packed with detail to make it more visually distinct from the Kingsfield or Armored Core series. The attention to detail really shows how much effort and passion went into Echo Knight. They took the risk to pour all of this time into a new series, even after the success of Kingsfield and Armored Core. Fromsoftware from this point experiment with many new concepts and genres, but being so early on in the company showing this level of craft makes it seem like Echo Knight was a passion project or something planned from near the beginning. The finely crafted environments further tie into the gameplay to make the experience more immersive, putting the player seamlessly in the role of Richard and guiding the player's thoughts by using that immersion as a mechanical storytelling medium in itself. Despite not being much of a horror game, I think it's still very much worth analyzing how effectively Echo Knight elicits tension over sound design and subversion of the established gameplay boundaries. This game feels very well versed in player psychology, as it's able to invisibly guide them through logic puzzles and offer hints only adjacent to particular puzzles, respecting player intelligence but understanding when and how the player will get stuck and where they will go next. It also utilizes this knowledge to scare the player, taking away former safety nets during the William Chase or Ghost King jump scare. There is also a PSP remake of Echo Knight that FromSoft created for their Adventure Player engine, which, if you could guess, was a player for adventure games. Users could create their own Echo Knight-esque first-person adventure or visual novel software. Echo Knight came packed in with this program as an example of its capabilities, but I won't be covering this version until I cover Adventure Player as a whole properly. Addendum: Echo Knight: The First Voyage on FromSoftware's Adventure Player software on the PlayStation Portable is not in fact a remake of Echo Knight. If anything, it would be classified as a demake, but beyond that, it's actually a prequel. This is what I get for not actually testing the software before I write the script, voice the whole video, and edit the whole thing until I figure that out. Fuck my life. Thank you for watching. I'm not entirely sure what game I'm going to cover next. I might make some small projects on unrelated PS1, Dreamcast, and PS2 games, and that will be whatever appeals to me at the time. I've actually tried playing Iru after writing this Echo Knight script, because it seemed to be a similar first-person adventure-style horror game. I'm not sure if anything is going to come from that. The game is interesting in some regards. Originally, I was thinking I could compare it to Echo Knight, either in this video or its own dedicated mini project, but Iru practically does not do anything better than Echo Knight, so it would have been like a trash fest on this very low budget PS1 horror game. That is something you can try if Echo Knight interests you, but it is definitely more of a classic adventure game and significantly less refined. As a warning. Thank you to longtime watchers of the FromSoft series, a special thank you to patrons Zap and Rouge Eclipser, and a final thanks to all of the commenters on the Echo Knight community post that helped ease my anxieties about this project and gave me some much needed morale to continue. I don't like to get too depressing or open about my negative thoughts, and I didn't really expect anyone to respond to it, let alone positively, with that many people. It's really hard for me to know if these videos are actually entertaining or worth people's time. All I can do is make them as good as they can possibly be without the perspective of how it impacts viewers because, well, I made it. This helped me get a glimpse that my work is actually valued, not just me hoping that it is. So again, thank you all. Even though I feel like there are plenty of other Echo Knight videos out there at this point, I hope that this one offered something unique with its perspective of all of its contemporary FromSoftware games. I will continue to do my best for all of you. Farewell.